Good morning and welcome to this continuity of the conference Crossing Histories and Ethnographies, and now with a fantastic roundtable session titled Anthropology in Portuguese Timor, Past, Present and Future, which is basically designed as a collective reflection on the theme of the conference, but mostly about the recent history of ethnography and anthropology in East Timor, and also with the view to point to new directions, reflect and reassess present and past trends. And for this, I think we are extremely privileged to be able to count with the contribution and wisdom of the pioneer scholars in the field who have actually did research in anthropology, in field work in East Timor in the 60s and 70s, and again after independence they have returned, apart from Claudine perhaps. No, you've been there in 98.
In 98.
No.
Before the independence.
Before the independence. And they have been also active participants, and they still are active participants in this process, and can bring up a number of issues and for our discussion. And basically the structure is quite open. We will have first short presentations by Claudine, David and Elizabeth Traube, about 15 minutes, and then an open discussion will follow, and you are all invited. We'll sort of engage in conversation very informally. So just a brief introduction of our speakers, and we'll then move on to their presentations. First, Claudine Friedberg, who is a professeur honoraire at the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, institution in which she works, or to which she is connected since 1956, and she is the director of a research team working on appropriation and socialization of nature at the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique in France. She was trained as a botanist and also as an ethnologist, and she has worked extensively and published extensively on the relationships between people and plants and nature, and especially working on the topic of popular classifications. She has published a number of works, and she did not do research only on East Timor, but also in Peru, Bali, Indonesia, Moluccas. And of course, the reason she is here is because of her work among the Buna people of Timor, in the company of Louis Berthe between 1962 and 1973. David Hicks is a professor of anthropology at the Stony Brook University in New York, and also a member of Clare College at the University of Cambridge. He has 2 doctorates in anthropology, one from the University of Oxford, another from the University of London, both based on fieldwork he carried out in East Timor with his wife Maxine, who is there, and in a way is also some sort of an anthropologist. Could be on this round table somehow as well. So in the late 60s, he did field work in Timor, in the area of Vikek, and he has a very wide interest in politics, kinship systems, oral literatures, ritual life. He has written a number of books, 5 if I'm not wrong. The first is Tetum, Ghosts and Kim, Structural Analysis in Anthropology is another, A Maternal Religion, Kinship and Religion in Eastern Indonesia, and also Cultural Anthropology, and the editor of Ritual and Belief. Elizabeth Traube is now our keynote speaker in this conference, so I've been already introduced her more extensively, but she is a professor of anthropology at Wesleyan University in the United States, and she has first received a BA in folklore and mythology from Radcliffe in 1970, and then a PhD in anthropology from Harvard University in 1977. So her dissertation was also about the Mumbai people, and East Timor, and among whom she did a field work in the early 1970s, when it was still a Portuguese colony. The book Cosmology and Social Life, Ritual Exchange among the Mambai of East Timor of 1986, was the monograph that resulted from her work in Timor, and it is an extremely significant book, especially for the topic of this conference. And Elizabeth has already presented us a number of thoughts she has following what to earlier work. She has published also on the topic of cultural and media studies while Timor was on blackout during the Indonesian occupation. A book, Dreaming Identities, Class, Gender and Generation, was published by the Westview Press, and since 2000 she has been returning to East Timor, like David Hicks, resuming her research and field work. So it's my great pleasure to start with Claudine, please. And
well, firstly, I would like to thank you very much for the invitation to the conference, and I would like to apologize for my bad English. I am sorry, but well, if I don't find an English word, I speak in French. I want to propose some idea for research by others, as I am not able to pursue this myself now. I think, well, it's work for other people. I think that it is important to challenge the colonial archive and what the Timor people have told of their own history, to challenge the statements given by archaeologists, geneticists and linguists, together with the mythology told by the Timorese themselves. I like the title of the paper of Andrew, Austronesian in Linguistic Disguise. I believe that there are many linguistic and cultural disguises in East Timor concerning the migration population throughout history. I will be talking essentially about the population speaking Buna. I do not say the Buna because I think that there are too many differences within the Buna speaking people in terms of culture, mythology, concerning their origins and the migration of their ancestors, and even in their language. For instance, my thesis concerns only one Buna village in the Indonesian part of Timor, because social organization, rituals and mythology were different from one village to another. Because of their geographical position on the border, the Buna were greatly involved in the partition of Timor up until the agreement between the Portuguese and the Dutch in 1914. As Antoinette Shepard wrote in his paper, Crossing the Border, Historical and Linguistic Divides among the Buna of Central Timor. Prior to the agreement, there was a Dutch enclave in the east, in Maogatal, and a Portuguese enclave in Lacmaras, and also in Noemuti, but this is outside of Buna territory. In this paper, Antoinette explained how Buna population moved from one territory to another before and after this agreement. This paper is above all interesting because Antoinette shows the influence of Austronesian languages on Buna. Buna speakers have en masse borrowed and adapted lexicon and grammatical construction, making it more similar to their Austronesian neighbors. As a result, the Buna language possesses a remarkable hybridity. This is all the more remarkable as the Buna are isolated in mountains of central Timor, far from the other non-Austronesian languages. It can be observed that words for male roles, for class, rank, and ritual lexicon were borrowed from the Tetun. However, I don't agree with some of the information Antoinette took from a paper by Stephen Farham about the conflict between several native Buna states and their allegiance to the Kingdom of Wehali and the Kingdom of Lycosaen. Stephen Farham's relies upon the Portuguese archive, but I agree with Andrew that there is too much willingness to accept colonial record. For instance, the Tarakae did not spoke Buna, but Tetun. Well, is the information I get. For instance, Weluli was his Kachamatan Lamaknen is in Tetun. The name is in Tetun. And, well, there are descendants of Tarakae in Atambua. There is a big family. One was secretaries of Beretalo, Bupati in Atambua. One of the daughter was the wife of Raja of Dirun, where I was living. One was priest, and another was a medical doctor. I think that he was the chief of the health in Dili during the Indonesian occupation. And I think all is the same, our brother and sister, and they say themselves that they are Tarakae, descendants of Tarakae. And they speak as many people in the a little Buna, Kemak, and Tetun. But they say that they are Tetun. While there is no doubt about the location of the center of the Kingdom of Wehali, the whereabouts of Lycosaen is less certain. The border between the two kingdoms and the allegiance to Wehali and Lycosaen change according to the informants. I am not sure that Likisa was the center of a kingdom. This is a work that is necessary to do with the archive and. In Buna mythology, the origin of the war between the two kingdoms, Lycosaen and Wehali, is a conflict between two brothers, Suriluai, the younger and chief of Wehali, and Lekiluai, the elder and chief of Lycosaen. According to my analysis of the myths and the data that I record on both sides of the border, it seems that the opposition between the two kingdoms is more of a symbolic organization of the world than a political reality. and sometimes the sense was perhaps opposition between Portuguese and Dutch, but it's not sure. The narration of the war between the two brothers belonged to the hot for the Buna, Tinogie, when the past of the ancestor, the Beigua, belonged to the cold. That is to say, the way of life. For the Buna of Aix-la-Macnaine, where I worked, it is impossible to mix the two stories. I explain after. In the Beigua, the Buna affirm that they migrated to La Macnaine and that their ancestors came from the east or southeast, what is to say from the Portuguese part of Timor. The Beigua is the story of the past of 3 lineages, descendants of 5 great ancestors coming from the sky. The importance to the Buna of Aix-la-Macnaine is that all their ancestors, after different migrations, met at Maliama-Canois, the location of which it is impossible to determine. It is clear that Beigua is an hybridization of the history of different ancestors coming from different places and perhaps with different cultural traditions. For instance, the ancestors of one of the 3 lineages, Luta, came directly from the sky to Maliama-Canois. Later they go to Sinamutin Malacca and were involved in the trade of sandalwood and wax, and arrived subsequently in Timor at Cabanassa in the south coast. For the Buna of La Macnaine, the passage of all the great ancestors by the same place, Maliama-Canois, is a way to affirm that it is a way of affirming that all their ancestors have the same status, that their patrimony, heritage, pusaka, has the same value. There is, in the Buna mythology, there is 2 origin of world. One is in the Beigua, in the cold way, and the other is in the hot way, the way of war, Tetetiep, and the place for this other origin is Panlubu Muklubu, the land of Lubu. And sometimes it's Lubu, Panlubu Salaer, perhaps the island of Salaer, perhaps it's the kingdom of Lubu in Sulawesi. And in this place, there is a difference between the noble coming from the sky and the people was made with mud. And for this origin, it's, all the people have not the same status. But for the Buna of Aix-la-Macnaine, they said, they affirm that they are all the same status. Another use of the mythology by the Buna, in your paper, David, Young Brother and Fish Hook.
Oh yes.
Yes, you relate one of the tale is Buna, where it's not a fish hook but a golden arrow. Yes, but we must think that there is a different level of interpretation. Your interpretation is a structuralist interpretation, is a interpretation, cosmogonical interpretation of that this tales is a relation with divinity. But what the Buna want to say with their tale, Mauipigulo, what they want to say is that they are not because the story is that the elder brother don't want to give a wife to his younger brother, but this wife are pig wife, and pig wife generally is is a manner to say that it's autochtone. Wife are autochtone, and I think that what the Buna of Lamacnen want to say is that they are not, because after the younger brother win, his brother give him he took the wife of his elder brother, but Buna said they are not descendant of this wife, but descendant of the two orange he changed in wife. They say the seeds of the seeds of the sea, and they said that they are descendant of this wife coming from the other world. Mm-hmm. It is another. It is interpretation inside the Buna. On comprend ce que je dis ou c'est impossible? Oui. It's a little difficult for me. Well. After different migration, doubtless within Timor, the descendants of the 5 great ancestors met again in a place called Tutuxolwa in Portuguese Timor, which is, according to Antoinette, the place from where the Buna language spread. The ancestors of the inhabitants of Lamacnen write from this place at a different period, and they took the place of the autochthonous called Melus, but there is no population with this name in Timor. And what is amazing is that the village kept the same structure with the same altar where they enter in the village and the autochthonous fly. Some immigration is more recent. In the village of Enes, new arrival claimed to be noble and that their people remained in the Portuguese part. This is one of the problems with the migration of population in Timor. Who moves and who remains in place? Generally, the newcomers maintain that there are nobles. And the political organization of Lamacnen changed with the independence, after the independence of Indonesia. At this time, Beritalo, the chief of Gewal, said his village was the capital of Lamacnen, and he took the title of Loro. Loro is not a Buna title. And after he became Bupati for all Kabupaten Belu, including Wehali. In the former organization, there were four chiefs. Beingonil, the village, the name was Gewal, Henes, Lakmaras, and Nualain, each with the same status. It is what the Buna said, that our 4 chiefs, but with the same status, and not one above the other, like Beretalo said when he took the power. At this time, before Beretalo took the power, in a speech before the offer of Bethel for an important ceremony, these four chieftainships are mentioned together with the name of their altar of the four villages. The beginning of the speech is very interesting. They say, Panomuk Masa, is great sky and land. Diruma Lakekun, the door for Wehali, Wesei Wehali, Po, is signification is sacred, Wasalu Lurai Portugal. We have first the invocation of Wehali shortly after the sovereignty of Portugal. Just before the agreement between the Portuguese and the Dutch in it was in 1911, there was a big war inside the Buna people caused by a conflict within the house of the feminine chief of Lacmaras, which was Portuguese at this time. I do not know that interpretation is given of this conflict in the Portuguese and Dutch archives. The problem with these archives is that the colonial administration did not understand the local social organization. For instance, they ignore the hierarchy of the power structure. A masculine chief for the exterior, a feminine and superior for inside the village. There is the same partition inside the house of chiefs, Oenola for outside and Oetil for inside. Generally, the colonial administration did not recognize the relevant people as chief, as we said yesterday. For instance, in Oeleu near Tapo, after relating their version of history, I was tested. To whom must I give back the betel basket? Successfully, I gave to the good person, because there was a chief for the Portuguese, but it was not the good one. What happened with this war in Lacmaras? The house of the feminine chief of Lacmaras. In this house, there are two Oenola with Pusaka and sign of the status in two different deals. This is another problem, a kinship problem. What is a deal? We have here a new case of hybridization or of disgrace in the matrimonial system of Buna in Lamaknen. The Buna have two forms of marriage. The more common and perhaps now the unique form is matrilocal, uxori local. The children belong to the house of the mother. In the other form that appears patrilocal, but appears, the children belong also to the house of their mother, but on the day of marriage, she enters into the house of her husband, as in Tetun marriage. The difference with the Tetun is that the descendant of a woman who enters the house of her husband remains separate. This is what the Buna call a deal. Each deal bears the name of the house which gave the woman. This type of marriage is the basis of the relationship wife-givers, wife-takers, the relation Maluai in Buna. That is so important in Buna society. For the house's ceremony, funeral, or reconstruction, all the Maluai must be invited. And the difference too is wife givers are not superior to wife takers for the Buna. Each deal can perpetuate with matrilocal marriage, but theoretically, the deal of the male and female founder of the house cannot disappear because they are the keeper of the sacred object, and for the noble, the things of power of the house. In the Beigua, the regalia are transmitted by men. The regalia they took with them when they come from the sky. But it seems that in recent times, these regalia are brought by women. When I was in Lamacnen, there were more adoptions than marriages. The compensation, price of the bride, was more or less the same for an adoption. But adopting an adult is safer than relying on the descendants of a woman. What happened in Lakmaras in 1911? On the death on one of Oenola, the other tried to take his status and function. Immediately, all the allied Maluai of the two parties arrived in Lakmaras to fight. Many of the young nobles of Lakmaras died in this conflict. Vengeance was taken during the Second World War. The Buna of Lamacnen burned a village in the Portuguese side, and later in 75 reprisals led to the razing by fire of Abyss, the village where I make my thesis. Sure, it is necessary to investigate the archive and to question local people to know something about the history of Timor, but we can also search the material remains. Even the people moved remains some proof of their particular culture. The ritual sits in stones, the altars. Well, I hope that people understand all.
I don't really propose to talk very much about kinship system among the Tetal people of that region. I want, in fact, to talk about something else. But the distinctions, the subtle distinctions that he drew in that article, which was published in LOM, I believe it was 1959, on the different forms of residence and inheritance, was something that I used as a gauge against which to compare what the people of Karobalu Suku in Vikek sub-district were doing. And just very briefly, I'll finish by saying that as far as the kinship system in Vikek is concerned, there has been much talk over the last few days of our two symposia of the Barlak, I never once heard anybody in Vikek, in Kaobalusuku, use the word. They don't have a word for marriage as such, but there are several forms of what in the Western languages we might refer to as marriage. There is the hafoli, the one that we usually talk about. Bride wealth is given, and a patrilineal regime follows, and the woman goes to live with in the man. In the man's house. It's patrilineal, but it's not asymmetric. The people there in the 60s knew about the system of asymmetric alliance. They knew about fetusa umane, which was the general term used in the Teton population, with variants. But they themselves didn't practice it, which, as you will find out somewhat later, is pretty ironic from my point of view. So they had the hafoli, which was the regular idealized form of marriage. But that didn't always occur, because for whatever reason, the men who would contribute to the bride wealth, the phonim of the young man who wanted to take a bride, would not contribute. There were various reasons why this was so. In which case, if the young people wanted to marry, they could, but the boy would go to the girl's house and live matrilocally, as you mentioned, so locally, and the children would belong to the bride's family. That was an inferior form of marriage. It didn't have so much status, and it was not something that young men desired to do, because it placed them in a very inferior position with regard to their father-in-law. And that was called the habani. And those were the two forms of, in quotations, marriage that were practiced in Kaobalu Suku. But they knew what the fetusa umani was, but they themselves said, well, we don't do it. No, in fact, did they do it? There was also another form of a situation, which I think Kelly has mentioned, called the hafen. I seem to have read that in one of your works. Literally, it means to take a woman, and it's not marriage. It's a form of, I suppose you could call concubinage. And that was the least desirable, but it was acceptable socially. So you have these four concepts, if you like, of some kind of union between a man and a woman. And what was interesting about Kaobalu Suku here is that most of the Teton regions are matrilineal descent and matrilocal residence. But here, for whatever reason, it might be, who knows, the influence of the Makasai or the Nawete, I just don't know. But they do have, as I've just described, matrilineal descent. However, the sub-district consisted of 10 sukus, and Kaobalu Suku is just one. In some of the other sukus, Luka Suku in particular, I'm thinking of, matrilineal descent and matrilocal residence was indeed the norm. Okay, I just wanted to mention that to link what I'm going to say up with what Claudine has said and the work of Louis Bert. Okay, what I actually want to talk about is Ruisinati. We saw the film yesterday, and we caught occasional glimpses of Sinati. And thank you for making this possible. It was a quite delightful experience seeing him again, and also seeing him as he was younger, because when he and I got to know each other, which was in 1965, or was 1964? Of course, he was a little bit older than he was in the films. And then when I saw him for the last time, 1973, of course, he was still older. So what I thought I'd do for the rest of my talk is to contribute to the, it's not the historiography, of course, of the history of Timor, but the, I have no idea what the word is, but the history of anthropology, if you like, in Timor-Portuguese, in connection with Sinati and that, and with him as my focal point. I'd never heard of the fellow until I went to Oxford University in 1962 to begin my work for PhD, a DPhil as they call it there. And I had originally decided that I wanted to do field work in Brazil. And I began learning Portuguese at the university in my first year, with the intention, it was the romantic intention, of course, of going into the forest there, right? And studying asymmetric alliance. And by the end of my first year, when I was visited by David Maybury-Lewis, and he said, you haven't a hope of finding any Jay-speaking people or any population at all in Brazil practicing, okay, the Balak, shall we say. I decided I was going to change. And I changed under the influence of Rodney Needham, who was interested, of course, in that, precisely that kind of thing. And when I told him after meeting Maybury-Lewis that I wanted to switch and, yes, go to Eastern Indonesia, which, as I think I mentioned yesterday, is teeming with societies that practice asymmetric alliance. Rodney Needham straight away said, well, Portuguese Timor is where you're going to go. And I said, well, thank you. Why there? He said, one, this is where this kind of marriage system is found. And two, he said there is trouble between Indonesia and England. It was the time of the confrontation between Indonesia and Malaya, and he thought it inadvisable for me to work in Eastern Indonesia at that time. And it was all right with me. So I readily assented. And then he said, well, you've got to get in touch with Rui Sinati. He was here last year. He studied at Oxford. We have connections with him. Write to him. And in fact, I did. And Sinati said, I'm coming to Oxford in the next few months or so. And let's talk. So he came to Oxford. This would be 1963, 1964. And we talked at long length. And he said, I'd be delighted to sponsor you. He liked conveying the impression that he was the doorkeeper, okay? And he said, no one gets to Portuguese Timor these days. He said, nobody at all. And he mentioned a case of an American anthropologist who we stopped going to, Orikusi, had a word with the government. And so I finished off the equivalent of a master's dissertation in preparation for going to Timor. And he said, well, look, you really should, he'd said when he met me in Oxford, you really should learn some Tetum before you go. And there's a course given by Father Basiliu Dessa in Lisbon, and I'll talk to him, and he'll accept you as a student. Yes. I said, well, are you sure? Well, he said, I am sure. Yes, I'm sure. And so Maxine and I decided we'd go to Portugal and learn Tetum. And he also said, it would be good if you were there too, because I will introduce you to government officials, and you will get a visa, but it would be helpful if you were to come and meet people who are involved in the ultramar. And of course we were very pleased to come. But fortunately or unfortunately, it depends on your stance, personal, professional. We couldn't immediately go because Maxine became pregnant. And so we decided we'd stay in England until our son, as it turned out, Paul, was born. And towards the end of that year, 1964, we got tickets, boat tickets, to go from Southampton to Lisbon in January. Right. Well, our son was born in December. And I said, fortunately or unfortunately, even more unfortunately, Father Saad died. We didn't know it at the time, but there was this letter from Sinati. Oh, don't bother to come, don't bother to come, don't bother to come. I've changed my mind. Father Saad has died. There's no point in your coming to Timor, to Lisbon anymore. Okay, but we got the ticket. So I didn't write to him as far as I can remember, because we were about to go and I didn't want him to follow up and say, don't come. Because I was beginning to assess the mercurial character that he was. And we came to Lisbon and we established ourselves in a hotel. And it was with some trepidation I found myself, Maxine and I, going to, I think I've got things wrong about the pregnancy, haven't I? Sorry, Maxine. Sorry. No, sorry. That was it. That was a year later. That was a year later. That was the delayed the making of the myth. Thanks for not interrupting me. That was the following year. It was that which delayed our trip to Timor. Anyway, we were delayed. And so it was with some trepidation. I knocked at the door of his house, of his apartment, and walked in. And he was somewhat surprised, but he was very pleased, I think. And introduced me to various people, acted like a guide and mentor in every sort of way. And after 3 or 4 months, we went back to England. I'd been given a research grant by London University, and one of the conditions was that I write a dissertation for them, for the university. So I said, okay, what the heck, because I'd already committed myself to writing a doctorate for London too. And so we came to Timor. And we got to Timor, I think, by March. And we started in Baucau, and then Baucau, and we had a building fixed up for us in Vikek Villa. We went down to Vikek and started doing the kind of preliminary work that all field workers do when they start field work. And I used fairly regularly to walk up the hill. Those of you who've been to Vikek know the hill, where the house of the administrator is located. And had a talk with the current administrator. It was very helpful, very kind, Senor Tellers. And it was on one of these occasions, about 6 weeks after we'd established ourselves. I walked up and I saw a familiar figure sitting down, smoking and talking to the administrator. And I thought my eyes had totally deceived me, because I had no idea Sinati was coming to Timor. You were, of course, been there quite a few months before. And I just stopped and turned around. I needed to think about this. And I went back to our house and I said, Maxie, I think Sinati's up there. I'm sure I've seen him. Well, when I saw the movie yesterday, I saw this figure. I said, Maxine, is that Sinati? Well, that was my feeling all those years ago. Is it Sinati? What the hell is he doing here? Lisbon's a long way away. And in those days, by the way, Lisbon, Europe, seemed like on the moon to us. It's quite remarkable, the difference. And so I came back to Maxine and had a glass of wine and said, well, I'll sleep on it and see him tomorrow, if it's him. And indeed, I didn't have to wait. Early next morning, Sinati was there at the door. He'd love to surprise you. yes. And I said, oui. And he came in and he said, I understand that you're disappointed with the ethnic group that I've allocated you. I said, well, they don't have prescriptive alliance, they don't have asymmetric alliance. So yes, I am. He said, well, I'll change. I'll put you somewhere else. Just like that. And I said, well, my visa actually says I can study the Teton-speaking people from Vikek all the way to Sulu and the border. And in an earlier conversation that we'd had in Lisbon, he said, that's a very big area. You'll find what you want somewhere in there. But go and start in Vikek. And I said, yes, the thing I've come to Timor to study is not here, not where I'm actually really. He said, well, Makassar, go somewhere else. He mentioned Fataluku. Yes, he did mention Fataluku. He said, I'm off to Los Palos the next couple of days. I want to speak with the Campagnolos who had gone there. And I said, who? And he said, oh yes, I didn't tell you, did I? I didn't tell you, did I? And he said there's Claudine, and there's Louis Baird, and the Campagnolos, Henri and Maria Olympia, and there's Brigitte Tamagiron, who's established herself with her baby in Marobo. Oh yes, he said, like the grand impresario. Yes, he said, come with me. He said, just come with me to Los Palos. I said, we've established ourselves here. We've got the house. I'm beginning to get to enter Tetum, the Tetum language. No, there are other things I'm sure I'll be able to find interesting, apart from asymmetric alliance. Well, he waggled his finger at me, and he looked at me, and he said, well, I gave you the chance, didn't I? And in those days, I wasn't the kind of politician I am now. But I was smart enough to figure out that he was making a mark for the future, so that if any time in later years I'd say, oh, well, I didn't really study the institution I wanted to, he could waggle his finger again. And he could say, well, I gave you the chance. Yes, okay. So I said, no, I'm very well content. I like the people here, they've been good to me, I like the administrator. He said, well, how many times has the administrator taken you around? I'm in the area, in his vehicle, in his Jeep. I said, well, no, none. He said, well, he will from now on. And sure enough, after he left sometime, the administrator, as they tell us, kindly came down and said, well, let's go to the beach down at Beasu for a picnic. And he took me to all the sub-districts, Wat Lawi, Wat Cabau, and La Cluta, the most beautiful of them all, which I would never have been able otherwise to go. So thank you, Rui, wherever you are. But he also said, look, I was going to go tomorrow, but I've heard that the recensimento, the annual census taking, is going to be carried out in the sub-district of Vikek, starting tomorrow, or the day after. Obviously, you should go. I told the administrator, he's got to get a horse for you. My wife's face dropped. Donkeys were the only things I'd ever thrown my foot over in the past. And Sinati said, I think I'll come as well. And so the next morning, we found these, the horses, the ponies, outside our house. And there was Sinati looking like John Wayne, looking like he looked in that movie at the end of, yes, when he was waving his arm. I actually, of course, I'd never known about his rides up in the mountains, but I was very impressed the way he sat in the saddle. He knew how to do it, which I didn't, did I? Actually, I didn't even get on. The thing threw me off straight away. And Sinati was kind of shocked and said, well, that maybe is a wild horse. So we asked for so we changed horses. And I had his horse, which had a real saddle on, and he sat with a Timorese saddle on his horse. And so we went up into the mountains, and we spent all day with the Sensimento. And then at the end of the day, he says, I've got to get to Los Palos. I'm going back. Would you like to come back with me, and then tomorrow morning I'll arrange for somebody to take you back up, because I'd like to talk to you. And we had a very, very pleasant 3 or 4 hour ride from the Suku, from the village, Povoisan, they were called in. No, Suku Beliu, in the mountains, down to Vikek, which of course is on the lowlands. And it was really very, very Timorese, beautiful Timorese night. It was cool, the moon was way up there, and we had some very nice conversations. It was very nice. Anyway, we got home, and he said, "I'll see you in the morning." So there he was in the morning in his in the jeep with his driver, and he said, "I want a photograph." And so he had his driver take a picture of Maxine and me, and in a way I wouldn't have expected. He picked up our little son, who was about 3 months old, 4 months old, 5 months old, little sprat he was, a white sprat, and he held him, yes, in a very nice gesture. And we've got that picture now. And then off he went, and we went. I went on my horse with my escort up into the mountains, and continued with the census work. I'm not a good correspondent, and he didn't write to me, and I didn't write to him. But I came back, and I finished my PhD for London. I finished my DPhil for Oxford, and in 73, Max and I came back to Lisbon for the second time, and I thought I'd pay him back for his surprising me in Vikek, and so I went to his apartment, which by now we were familiar with, and banged on the door, and he opened it, and oh boy, was he stunned to see us. And I said, "Oui," and he was delighted. He was delighted to see us, and even more delighted when I showed him my Oxford dissertation, and I said, "Well, you know, I'd really like to have it published in Portugal." And so he said, he was delighted, right? And he said, "Yeah, I'll get it. I'll get it published for you." And right. And then, of course, the 25th of May, 1974, and manuscripts were of no importance, of course, at that time. And that was it. That was the end of it. And then I heard that he died, and that was the end of our connection. But I don't think I would have gone to Timor if it hadn't been for Sinati, and I treasured our relationship, even though it was an intermittent sort of one. And I think when people talk about Portuguese Timor, it's quite right that they think of Rui Sinati, and I'm just so pleased. I've learned 13 hours of film about him in the museum. He could be difficult. He caused me a few problems. I couldn't handle him then. I could handle him now, but I couldn't handle him then. But he had a great affection for Timor, and what more can you ask? And that's my in and out.
Well, thank you for sharing this with us, David. Let's see.
Okay. Well, first of all, I thank you once again for organizing all of this. It's a pleasure to be here with the two of you. I did take Ricardo at his word that this could be very informal. And then thanks to U.S. Airlines, I didn't have the time on Sunday that I thought I would have to kind of collect some thoughts. So this is really very impromptu and off the cuff. Just in response to what David was saying about Senati, it just really I had the similar experience of, it really was like that. If you were going to go to Portuguese Timor, you had to get permission from Senati. Nothing could happen without that. And, I came to Lisbon and met him and did eventually get him to agree that I could go to Timor. He didn't, it wasn't as hands-on, so he didn't I don't recall him being involved in what people I would study, but as I mentioned yesterday, I started with Galoli and ended up with Mumbai. But what was really eerie is that the very last scene in the film that we saw last night was in fact Hohul, the place where I ended up, that he would have ended there, that film ended with, and you saw that door, where you saw the stone door, that's the east gate to Hohul. So I don't know, there's some creepy, like maybe he knew all along. Anyway, just a few very brief remarks about the notion of past, present, and future. And I'm going to talk more about going back to Timor. But what was really most striking to me is how, in contrast to my first field work, on the return visit, one was continually aware of the present as enmeshed in history. You were always aware of a moment that was shaped by what had come before it and that was looking forward to the future. These were the eventfulness of life, if you like, which was precisely what I was trying to suggest yesterday. I continually kind of marginalized. People would be telling me stories about events, but I would be looking for the structure, for the kind of timeless relations. And whether because anthropology had changed in the interim, but more than that, I think because of things that had happened on Timor, you couldn't marginalize events. You couldn't live in an eternal present. You were continually aware of both stuff that had happened, and you were continually aware of people's sense of changes still to come, of the future to come. So there was no possibility of ignoring history. In terms of Andrew's, just a quick comment on Andrew's paper yesterday, it wasn't for lack of going to the archives. I had actually done a summer of archival work, but just, kind of wrote a paper for my specials paper and then did ethnography and forgot about it. So anyway, so time was everywhere on the return. At the most kind of immediate level, returns, particularly when you're returning after 26 years, time is embodied. The sense of time passing is is present in the aging process, which Timorese never tired of pointing out. And this was actually to me really, really jarring, because one doesn't really talk, Americans don't talk about getting older. But the number of times I'd have situations where I'd be with one person who had known me before and someone who hadn't, and the person who knew me before would be talking across me to the other person saying, "Oh, God, she was here, you should have seen her then, she had long, beautiful, straight hair, and now." So you continue. There was simply that you're older. Was always being presented, but obviously much more important than my aging was the dramatic past was theirs, and that was, of course, the other thing that everyone. The first thing that would happen would be for them to tell you what they'd been through, I still remember when the night that I first went back Erebisa, which was the household that I lived in, and one by one, people came out, and we went inside. The house had been burned by the militia, so it was a beautiful old stone house, but the walls were all kind of black, and we sat in the dark, and people just, the first thing was kind of a list of who was alive and who was dead. And then people would always tell you, would give kind of narratives of what their life had been like, particularly in the years from 75 to 79, when they were in the forest, as they put it. And you'd get, long sort of trek narratives about where we went. And but then again, everybody had a story to tell. And again, this time it still took me a while to figure out some of the time that was, because for one thing, it took some time to get my Mumbai back. I mean, it's been 26 years. But we went to visit Mobalan, who was the man I told you about, who I worked with before. And again, though it took me weeks to figure it out, what Mobalan was doing was telling me stories of his involvement in this movement over the course of the occupation. But I didn't actually realize it until other people started telling the story, because what happened is they started telling contestant versions, and because Mobalan was saying that people had, that Hohul and the Ramos had gotten angry at him because they accused him of trying to steal the role of the kuka, the ritual speaker, and I mentioned that to someone else who said, no, it had nothing to do with that. It had nothing to do with that. It was the false prophet thing. And then proceeded to tell this long story about this movement that Mobalan had been involved in. I'm not going to talk more about that. But so everybody wanted you to know what they had endured, what they had suffered over the course of the occupation. Sometimes they would tell them solemnly, sometimes more comically. So the thing that was as striking as this continual awareness of the past and of the events that people had gone through was the sense of anticipation and expectations of the future that was equally palpable. You could never be. There was no eternal present of the kind that we create in certain kinds of ethnographies. There was no possibility of timelessness because people were always talking about time. And so the other thing during the transition, I went back in October 2000, stayed through, I think, June, so during the UN transition. And that was a period of considerable anxieties. The parties were forming very rapidly. And the initial response in Ilea was, no, we don't want parties, we just want Fretilin. Particularly because there were so many parties forming. And I'd say things like, well, it's democracy, you got to have parties. They'd say, well, first of all, obviously, the Timorese history of parties was parties form and there's war and we're dead. So they had a point there. And then plus, remember, this is now November 2000, this was the contested U.S. election, and people knew about that, and they'd say, well, hey, you've only got 2 of them, and you guys can't even elect a president, so how are we going to do it with 12 parties or whatever? Got a point. So anyway, there, like with a lot of things on Timor, people started out being, no, we don't want that, but they kind of adjusted pretty quickly to the party system. But the last thing that I just wanted to talk about in relationship to the parties and to Ricardo's question yesterday about the differences between the colonial state and the national state. This was really very striking because there was ambivalence toward the state was nothing new. as I think I said yesterday, there was, on the one hand, you could have an ideology of reciprocity projected onto the Portuguese presence, but with very much still with a sense of that the Portuguese were continually forgetting their obligations and violating the pact and so forth. But the difference, and there was a similar kind of, suspicion. But now the language was much more populist, so the language was of the big people. The party leaders were the big people, and we're the little people, and lots of complaints about how the big people they sit in Dili, they don't come down, they don't come and talk to us. That was one of the contrasts to the clergy, that the clergy went among us, but there was a real mistrust of, populist mistrust of the leadership. That I talked about a little yesterday, but the thing that to me was most strikingly different was this new category of the people, povo, which was not a term that was ever used back in the 70s. When we talk about the domain, when I talk about the formation of the domain in myth, the subjects are women and men. They're not, they're not the owners of the kingdom. They're actually the problem. They're the ones whose anarchy needs to be overcome in order to establish a domain. Whereas the nation is very strongly created by, purchased by the people, is the way it's continually. I'm sure people have heard the same phrase about how the nation was purchased with our blood and our bone, not with silver or gold, but with the suffering of the people. So this, if there's as everybody knows, a widely distributed notion of being owners of the land, but now it's the people who are the owners. And so there was very much, in other words, a sense of having claims upon the new state, and maybe not trusting it to fulfill them, but strong sense of obligation, an obligation to us because we suffered, because we died, because we sacrificed, and now we're owed our morin, our livelihood was the way it went, the language that was used. So there was a very sharp awareness of the way I'd like to put it is of the nation as a site from which people made claims upon the state, and that the nation was made by the people. The state was parties, but parties alone, couldn't. Parties alone couldn't make anything. Only the people could make the nation. So anyway, so that was this. The one again really striking difference was just way less deference than there used to be. Obviously, that's contextual, and Southeast Asia, there's still be plenty of places where people would be respectful and so forth about the leadership, but not in private. I mean, there was much more of a kind of sense of a public space, I guess, that hadn't been there before. So you could be, wherever, sitting in somebody's house or having a drink somewhere, and everybody was very aware of what was happening in Dili. The versions were often a little bit distorted, but people were living a life that extended beyond the villages, and where they were continually concerned about the implications for their lives now of the form that the state would take. So a whole kind of reconfiguring of the relationship between the people and the state. And yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And I would like to invite you to now, participate and those questions. I will not say much at the moment. I'd like you to sort of join in the conversation, having as a trigger of these statements and the talks. I'll just ask you please to use the microphone so we can keep track.
well, maybe to get the party going, oh.
Okay, hello. I will just start with a very small question, but it is when hearing you about your experiences in the 60s and 70s, it came to my mind the book by Luis Cardoso, the Timorese writer, Crónica de uma Travessia. And when he writes about his youth in Timor, I think in the 60s, there is a fragment in which he says, there were rumors reaching us about an American anthropologist who was studying or who was interested in things, in phenomena, which we as young boys were taught by the Portuguese that they had no interest and that they had to disappear. And I was always wondering who would have been this American anthropologist. If I remember well, it was a woman. He was talking about a woman, and it was a rumor. That is just a question to start with. Very, very, very simple, and perhaps it will always be an enigma.
And just to complete your comments, Luis Cardoso made another reference to you, Elizabeth, in a tale. In the book I have organized with Lúcio. Do you remember, Lúcio? The first chapter, there is a reference to you as a kind of a James Joplin arriving in Timor.
I was a little hippie.
I just want to make a very general question to you, to elicit a comment. My point is this. We Portuguese have a strong emotional relation to Timor. Of course we do, and I think that the fact that the Indonesian occupation was the worst case of our decolonization, and then we had an opportunity to put it right through a very participatory process, helped in healing even the divide which marked the Portuguese relation with decolonization. But my point is to have you comment on a slightly different thing. If you compare statistical data on colonial presence, Timor can be seen as a very extreme case of a weak colonialism. The number of Portuguese that were there was very limited. The number of facilities that Portuguese put up in the country was very small. The number of schools, the number of doctors. One anecdotal evidence is the governor once in the 60s asked money from Lisbon to develop the harbor. And the Lisbon government said, send us a budget estimate. And he replied, I can't make it because there is no single engineer to draw the plans. But on the other hand, listening to everybody who has been speaking in this conference, the presence of the Portuguese seems to have been much more important than these simple statistical data. So how do you actually evaluate these form of Portuguese colonial rule? What was the real impact? Anyone else?
Maybe perhaps we can have your comments or answers, reactions to this first. Can you go first?
Well, I think that there's obviously a connection between the weakness of the Portuguese colonial state and the kinds of ideological incorporations that we've been talking about. I mean, I don't think that a stronger colonial state would be incorporated in the same way that the Portuguese. I can't imagine a narrative like the Mumbai Portuguese as returning younger brothers, if there had been a more intense experience of exploitation. So, in other words, there's a connection between the political economic weakness of the state and the ways in which indigenous peoples interpreted the Portuguese presence and drew it into their world. So, in terms of the impact, though, I think we're still working that out, as a number of us have been saying. So much of you talk about the indigenous domains. Well, the word for domain is reino. It's Portuguese. It's kingdom. There was a continuous kind of pressure to territorialize systems that I don't think were territorially defined. And people, Judith and I were saying, suku. People will always say suku. We didn't have suku, and it's a Tetum term, but it got imposed across the province. So one of the things that the Portuguese did was to try to standardize an administrative system, and that ended up transforming the local polities. But people, what you would get would be these maintaining two different systems. So, for instance, people would talk about the suku. Okay, the suku is the colonial system. We're organized into sukus. We go there for the census. We pay our taxes through the suku. But we also belong to our kingdoms. They call it the old kingdoms. And so those systems still operated for ritual purposes and were materialized in ritual events. But again, I think what it is there's no purely traditional. They're all kind of implicated in one another. So I think in terms of the, I think we're still working through what the impact of Portuguese colonialism was on political organization. And again, it varies from one region to another. Last thing I'll say, I do think that the diarchies, it's something I was trying to get at yesterday, that the kind of, the diarchic language persists throughout Timor and is materialized in various kinds of structures, but that balance between the political and the ritual was, I think, irreversibly affected by the Portuguese colonial presence in ways that marginalized sacral authorities and that put them in particularly kinds of difficult positions. So if you think about, in the Hohul and the Romos, it's like a kind of classic double bind, because they kind of felt like they had to continually assert their roles as the original founders of the polity, and every time they did that, they made themselves vulnerable to charges of usurpation. So again, there's an impact at the level of local politics.
Well, I'd just like to add a few words to that. Remember that the Portuguese presence in one way or another has been over 3 centuries, and there had been a lot of intermarriage between the Portuguese who'd come to Timor and the local population. Remember the Topazes, of course, who had a tremendous influence on Timorese history. And that endured right up to the present, of course. And during the period of 74, 75, these critical years in the modern history of Timor, many of the party leaders were half Portuguese, half Timorese. And even when we were there in the 60s, as it were, in a very unscientific way, we compared the kind of existence we had in Timor with what we'd known in Lisbon. It seemed to us that there was a great deal of compatibility between the two populations. As I told Sinati, he was rather pleased about that. But that's something that did strike us. And I don't think the same was true in West Timor. Dutch Timor, in fact, I think the relationship that the Dutch colonial colonists had with the local population was different from that of the Portuguese colonial officers. And I think that's reflected in today, where the Portuguese presence is, from what I've seen, considerably greater than ever it was in the 1960s, and certainly more Portuguese people. And who would have imagined it? I mean, in December 1975, the situation now where the Portuguese presence, as I say, I think is stronger than ever. And you mentioned the future, Betsy. Who knows what the future will hold in terms of the Luzonization, if there is such a word, of Timor. Tetum is getting more like Portuguese every year or so.
Well, there is a old influence even in the west part, and most around Oekusi. Even some of ancestors, for instance, in the kingdom of Insana, in the west part, with the name of the ancestor, you see there is a big Portuguese influence. The name is Luis or Maria, and well, and this is around Oekusi in the Indonesian part.
And just cuisine. I don't know if it's true everywhere, but in Aileo, it was really strange. People, they resisted Indonesian cuisine. They did not adopt it. And so weddings still now, the food is all Portuguese when you do banquets, music, things like, so that I mean, that's more among the elites, but there was a real kind of conscious, no, we're not going to take on the Indonesian cuisine. What about, though, I'd be interested in people's thoughts, because language is obviously a really politically charged issue. I haven't been back for a while now, so maybe stuff has changed, but I know that there was a tremendous, particularly among the new generation, who, the Indonesian educated youth who didn't speak any Portuguese, a real sense of being marginalized by making Portuguese one of the official languages. And I still, having Portuguese as the main language taught in the schools seems to me problematic. I mean, that was, a lot of people felt that was the 75 generation for whom Portuguese had been the language of access to the world, but for the younger generation, it was Indonesian.
And what happens now with the old hierarchy in Timor-Leste? Because the people in I forget that I was in years 80 in Atambua, and people said at this time that the people in Timor-Leste escape in the mountains because Fretilin want to abolish the feudality, abolish the hierarchy. And this is the point of view of people in the west part. And what happens now with this old hierarchy? Except for the ritual and so on, but for the political power there is no more hierarchy, or how it is now?
Strong as ever.
Yeah, they get elected now.
Yeah.
A lot of the old, well, traditional is a tricky term, but the former rulers will be elected by their villages.
Elected now.
Just thank you, Claudine, for your comments on. I just wanted to raise a couple of the issues that you mentioned. I thought were very interesting, and they relate to kind of the some of the imponderables of the sort of ancient history of Timor that are never really resolved. They remain as problems to be tackled or kind of mulled over, and maybe come up with ideas like likusain, this idea of likusain, which has always been a sort of controversy in the history of Timor. Yeah? One thing I was going to say to that is that on the basis of Emily Velfeld's work in southern Alor and my own visits there, the people there have this strong idea that they came from Timor, their origins are in Timor, and they use this phrase, likusain maubara. So when you say likusain, it's probably not likusain. From their point of view, they still see a connection between likusain and maubara. And I'm not sure what that means really either, but I was just wondering whether it's related to the Kailaka Wars. And the other one was the Lublubu you talk about. I was just going to say that Skulta Nordahl in his book refers to those couplets. He has Lublubu Makasa Taktaka Kesnai, he said. And as I understand it, Kesnai is the same as Melush. It's that original population that got kind of wiped out at some point. But the Lublubu, I think he refers to as the banners of Makassar, and talking about the Makassar Wars of the 17th century.
Well, in Wihali, they said, well, Makassar, that spoke of Makassar, but the Buna said, yeah, only Panlubu Moklubu or Panlubu Salayer.
Yeah. Clearly some kind of reference to Sulawesi.
Yeah, it's a reference, yes.
But beyond that, can I just say a couple of things about the future? And I was thinking in terms of the future research possibilities for Timor-Leste. And there's a couple of things that I've always been interested in and see opportunities for. And one is a study of the Kingdom of Lucca. There is no sort of historical ethnography of Lucca, even though it was such an important entity or idea, particularly in the, late sort of 17th, late 18th, 19th centuries. It seems to be early 19th centuries. It was very strong, the notion of Lucca. So I thought that was an area that someone has an opportunity to do some very interesting work, I think. The other one is this idea that I think about, but I haven't really sort of progressed. It seems to me there's a kind of broad distinction between East and West in Timor, not the sort of contemporary notions of Lorosai Loromono, but in the structures of society, in that I often see in all those upland areas, Mambai, Bobanara, so on, they have these very orderly, structured communities of chiefs, of particular functions within the structure of the domain. You don't see that, I don't see that kind of complexity in the East, in somewhere like the Fataluka groups. There's nothing comparable in terms of the structures of the houses. And I'm wondering, I don't know what that says, whether it speaks to this question of some kind of non-Austronesian roots or whatever, but it does seem to me to be some kind of broad distinction that's worth maybe thinking about. I don't know. That was another idea. And just one more, if I could.
Yeah.
One issue that I've always found interesting, and another one of these ones that's very hard to kind of get at the origins of, is the question of sandalwood, the development of sandalwood, because it has such an important place in the history of Timor, of course. And it's always struck me, as a result of some of the work that I've done, that sandalwood grows really well in old dos. Yeah, when people clear the land, burn it, then you get sandalwood growing. And it strikes me that it's an indicator. It's kind of not really a subject for historians or anthropologists, maybe for archaeologists, but the origins of sandalwood in Timor might well be the origins of agriculture in Timor, and that when people moved in to start clearing on a larger scale, that's when you started seeing sandalwood grow more widely, and it sort of had such a big impact on the subsequent fortunes of the island. I'll just leave it there.
Oh, thank you. But just taking on your question to challenge it as well, to suggest a bit, to talk about the future in the way Andrew was suggesting.
Well, what will be interesting is to know the displacement of the sandalwood, because I think that the sandalwood was not always in the same place in Timor. And after the problem of by what harbor the sandalwood go out of Timor, because well, we know that the South Sea is not a good sea, but it seems that well, Wehali is in the south, and well, there is something to search here in relation to the trade of sandalwood and wax, perhaps, because the bees, well, it's not domesticated bees. They're migrant bees. They come at the same time. Well, it's necessary to make some search on this problem too.
Andrew, when you ask about the East and the West, I mean, what are you trying to get at? The political tension there?
No, not really.
Just
the organisation of the houses seems to be somehow qualitatively different. There's a certain, I won't call it egalitarian, there's a lack of structure within Makassar and Whakawutu sort of organisation that's much more ordered in Mumbai or Kemak, where it seems to be.
I remember one of Mount Balin's daughters was being married to a Makassar, who was one of the Falentil in Ileo, and there was a exchange ceremony going on, and inside the house all the Mumbai people were just making fun of how bad the Makassar were at all this, and they just had no sense of hierarchy or order.
Yeah, that's my point anyway.
But it worked still.
It's kind of flat. You know?
Yeah.
That the houses are sort of equal. There's a sense each has a place, and when they move into the area of another house, yes, there's a sort of hierarchy develops, but each has their own place, and they're all equal. I get a sense of that.
Well, Andrew, when we went to Timor, we had also this notion of Luca as almost a rival to Wehali, this reputation of the kingdom, Luca. And it was with some disappointment that we saw that Luca had been sadly decimated and reduced to the level of what in those days was called a suku. Relatively small population, matrilineal though, matrilocal like Wehali. And the reason, it's on a plain, of course, it's on the lowlands, and or the remnant of it was and is on the lowlands. And the reason that people gave for that was the mosquitoes. They left because the mosquitoes, the land was quite wealthy, but they didn't want the mosquitoes. Rationalization or whatnot, that's what they said. And I think the Deputy Prime Minister, Guterres, right? Guterres, he is from Luca. Yeah, and he used to come into our house as a little boy.
Classic empty stand.
He used to come to our house and be known to us when we were carrying out inquiries in the local Bogosorish. He, who would, I think about 5 or 6 years old, would come in with the gang just as soon as we turned the corner and went off. And they'd come in and they'd play with Paul, our little boy, just hug him and do whatever they wanted to do, and make sure they were out of the way by the time we returned. And it was only in the 1990s, when he came to Long Island to give a talk about Indonesian independence, that he confessed as such. He said, I was one of those little lads who used to put my face through the window of your house. He said I was the son of the Valirai of Luca. But it would be very interesting to know what happened to Luca. There was a hostile relationship between the kingdom of Vikek and Luca and the kingdom of La Cluta was allied with Vikek against Luca. And Luca had a queen, who was a very great warrior queen. Who was invulnerable to machete and arrows.
I mean, I also say that because there's a lot of remnants of memories of Luca. You see that in our temple. People have sacra that's supposedly from Luca.
Oh.
It turns up in lots of places. It turns up in the early histories, the earliest histories where Luca is a kind of known entity in the 16th century. So it just has a long visibility.
Well, just on this and my just share a couple of thoughts. They are not very well organized, but my idea in going to Timor is I heard a lot about these kingdoms of the southern coast, and not just Luca, but also like Wehali, as well as they call the Loros. Claudine, you talk of the Loros. They call Loro Tires, Loro Jaimea. In all this, what to me seems to be centers of power in the southern coast, from where regalia emanates, like all these rotas and flags and things that come from this. And reading Simões Martinho the other day, it talks about how after Manufai, all the big kingdoms disappeared. And the kings that, the reminiscence of these are smaller ones that have good relations with the Portuguese and all of that. And he talks about like the three wars of Manufai, Boaventura being the last one, but also his father before kind of have a big war. And this goes back to Camnassa wars and all these things that late 19th century and Celestino da Silva really have an impact on the local politics. And just the other day in Timor, Fernando Figueiredo was giving a talk on the coffee and the implementation of agriculture systems, and how the Portuguese had problems having access to land because the local rulers will have like control over the land, and how they have to kind of finish these traditional systems in order to have access to land they could cultivate. And to add to this, another thing which like in East Timor people talk about 3 moments of people coming, the general idea, but like a couple of 2 or 3 times people told me about the 3 moments where people come, the first one going up to the mountains, the second one to the middle lands, and the third to the kind of the flat lands. And all of this kind of make me think on maybe a strong center of power in the southern coast that kind of got whipped out end of the 19th century, maybe by the Portuguese, and after that you have smaller structures that existed beforehand, but maybe like I see the story of Ainaro, and maybe yesterday as well, like the history of.
Well, I wanted to actually say something very similar.
Okay, yeah.
Because I don't know whether anyone knows the article by Douglas Cameron about where he argues that Kaladi Firaco is actually possibly not east-west but highland-lowland. And I wanted to add to Andrew's comments about east and west, actually the kind of highland-lowland dimension as well. And it's always been my impression, and I don't know whether that's true or not, is that highland societies are less hierarchical than the lowland places. And I wonder whether perhaps what you were describing in terms of the very complex ritual hierarchies, that is maybe precisely a way of avoiding other forms of hierarchy to develop, yes, of to deflating, to have this kind of complex ritual hierarchy. I don't know. It was just an idea that I thought actually maybe looking at the east-west in addition to the upland-lowland in terms of the difference between spiritual and political authority might be a really kind of interesting addition to that. I don't know.
You can find in the description of Kingdom of Wehali by Gérard Francillon, he makes this opposition inside Wehali between lowland and highland. there is you can find something on this.
You also find this in VCAG, where the Tetum-speaking population refer to themselves and those who live on the lowland, which in that area is mainly, of course, Tetum, as the Fehan, and they refer to the people up in the mountains as the Foho. That is the distinction that they draw. And of course, there are all sorts of connotations of Foho that they have, which are not very flattering to the Makasai. No way, right?
I think that distinction holds the up and lowland.
Right.
Fewan, and Fehan means cultivated, civilized, all the rest of it.
Right. And that echoes in the stereotype of Claudine as the stupid, the simple, structurally complex, maybe. Because I don't think that at least in Timor, the uplands aren't as egalitarian as the main, you don't get the same strong opposition that, say, Scott would talk about for the mainland, where, they're much more egalitarian in the hills. But
excuse me, sorry. I would like to, we have to stop for reasons of schedule and etc. And I would like to invite you to continue a conversation over lunch. We have a table booked in a nearby restaurant. We'll still have our book launch. Will be the final event of this conference, which I invite you to come after lunch to hear about Kelly Silva's work. And Andrew McWilliam will also present some publications. And that's it. Thank you so much. This was really brilliant. Thank you.